Little girl whispered, "Please. My chest hurts so much." Then a millionaire CEO found her and, "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much." The snow was falling in thick layers, covering the street in a blanket of white. The world was quiet, the sound of each step muffled by the heavy snowfall. It was Christmas Eve. And while the city was alive with lights and music, a sense of loneliness hung in the air. Caleb Whitmore, the CEO of one of the most successful companies in the city, walked alone, his coat pulled tightly around him. His thoughts were distant, distracted by the emptiness that seemed to surround him. Even in a crowd, he had everything: money, power, success, but somehow he still felt empty. As he walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. It was just another reminder of the people who sent their obligatory holiday wishes, the ones who never truly cared. He glanced up ahead, nearing the old bench by the lake, where he often came to clear his mind. But as he drew closer, something caught his eye. It was a small figure, curled up on the ground, shivering in the cold. A little girl, no older than 7 or 8, was wrapped in a thin, wet coat. Her hair was matted with snow, and her eyes wide, terrified, locked onto his as he approached. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Please, my chest hurts so much." The words pierced Caleb's heart, and for a moment, he froze. There were no signs of adults nearby, no indication of where she had come from or why she was out here alone in the snow. As he moved closer, he saw that she was clutching something tightly in her arms. A small, stuffed animal, soaked from the snow. She looked so fragile, so lost, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt something stir inside him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, though he didn't know if he was asking her or himself. The girl's eyes filled with fear as she looked up at him. She didn't speak for a long moment, just held her stuffed animal tightly. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I don't want to go back. Please don't take me back." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. The words, so simple, yet so desperate, made his chest tighten. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Who was she? Why was she out here all alone? As his thoughts swirled, a cold gust of wind blew through the alley, sending a shiver through him. He kneeled beside her, ignoring the snow that soaked through his pants. Gently, he placed his hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her. "I won't let anyone hurt you," he promised. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. But there was a flicker of hope there, a tiny spark that said, maybe, just maybe, someone cared. Caleb didn't know what to do next. He had never been the type to get involved in other people's problems, especially not like this. But something about this little girl, sitting alone in the cold, made him want to protect her, to make sure she was safe. Without another word, he lifted her into his arms. She was light, almost too light, as if she hadn't eaten in days. He wrapped his coat around her, trying to shield her from the cold. "You're safe now," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. As he carried her to his car, he made a silent promise to himself that he would do whatever it took to make sure she was all right. Caleb carefully placed the little girl in the back seat of his car. The warmth of the interior, a stark contrast to the cold, harsh world outside. She was still clutching her stuffed animal tightly, her small body trembling from both the cold and the fear that lingered in her eyes. Caleb glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his heart heavy with the weight of her silence. He had promised her she was safe, but he wasn't entirely sure how to keep that promise. He started the car, the engine humming softly, and as the car slowly pulled away from the park, he found himself asking the same question again and again in his mind. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why was she alone? The streets were quiet, the city's usual bustle muted by the snow that continued to fall, gently coating everything in its path. Caleb kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept glancing at the little girl in the back seat. She hadn't spoken a word since he'd found her, but every so often, her eyes would meet his in the mirror. Each glance was filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place: fear, trust, maybe both. After what felt like an eternity, Caleb pulled into the parking lot of a small clinic. He didn't know why he chose it, but something inside told him that it was the right place to take her. He turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The cold air hit him like a slap, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the little girl. He gently opened the back door and helped her out, careful not to disturb the stuffed animal in her arms. "Come on, sweetheart," he said softly. "We're going to get you some help." The girl didn't resist, though she still looked up at him with cautious eyes. She was so small, so fragile, and Caleb felt a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years stir within him. As he walked her toward the clinic, he couldn't help but wonder how she had ended up on the streets, alone, in such a vulnerable state. They entered the clinic, and the nurse at the front desk immediately noticed them. She looked at Caleb, then at the little girl, her eyes widening in concern. "Is she all right?" the nurse asked. Caleb nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was telling the truth. "She's just cold and scared," he said, his voice tight. "Can you help her?" The nurse didn't hesitate. "Of course," she replied, leading them to an examination room. Caleb sat down in the chair beside the bed, watching as the nurse gently removed the little girl's wet coat and wrapped her in a warm blanket. The girl's eyes fluttered closed, and for the first time since he'd found her, Caleb allowed himself to relax just a little. He looked down at his hands, trying to process what had happened in the past hour. He had been walking alone, lost in his own thoughts, and now here he was, sitting in a clinic with a little girl who needed help. He thought about his own life, the emptiness that had consumed him for so long. He had everything he could ever want: wealth, success, the admiration of others, but none of it had ever filled the hole in his heart. He had never really had a family, never known what it was like to have someone who truly cared. He didn't even know how to begin taking care of this little girl, but something inside him told him that he had to try. As the nurse finished her examination, she turned to Caleb. "She's very weak," she said gently. "We'll need to run some tests, but she's going to be all right." Caleb nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He watched as the nurse left the room, closing the door softly behind her. The room was quiet again, except for the sound of the little girl's soft breathing. Caleb sat there for a long time, lost in thought. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation, but this was different. He couldn't control this. He couldn't fix her past, couldn't undo whatever pain she had suffered, but he could give her something he hadn't given to anyone in years: his time, his attention, and his care. The thought hit him like a revelation. For so long, he had been living in a world of success, a world that demanded so much from him that there was no room for anything else. But now, with this little girl, he felt something stirring inside him. a desire to protect her, to make sure she never had to feel alone again. He leaned forward in his chair, watching her closely. She was so small, so fragile, but there was a strength in her that he couldn't deny, a quiet resilience, the kind that only came from surviving the harshest of circumstances. Caleb didn't know where her journey had started, but he knew that from this moment forward, it would be different. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he promised himself that he would do whatever it took to help her. The little girl stirred in her sleep, her hand reaching out for her stuffed animal. Caleb reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I'll make sure you're safe." The soft beep of the heart monitor was the only sound that filled the room, a gentle reminder that the little girl was still with him. Caleb sat in the chair beside her bed, watching her sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. He had never felt so lost in his life. He had done the right thing by bringing her here, to safety. But that didn't change the questions that still swirled in his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? And what had happened to her to bring her to the point where she was so afraid? The nurse had told him she would be all right, but Caleb knew there was more to her story than just a cold body needing warmth. He couldn't shake the image of her face when she whispered, "Please, my chest hurts so much." That moment replayed in his mind over and over, each time with a new layer of understanding. This wasn't just about her physical pain, there was something deeper, something that made her afraid, something that made her want to hide. The door creaked open, and Caleb looked up to see the nurse walking in, a clipboard in her hands. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice soft but professional. "We've run the tests, and the results are good. She's stable, and there doesn't appear to be any major internal injuries. But," she paused, looking at him with a quiet sympathy, "she's been through a lot, mentally, emotionally." Caleb's heart tightened at the nurse's words. He had known this. He had felt it the moment he saw her, but hearing it aloud made it more real. She wasn't just a little girl in need of help, she was someone who had been hurt. And that hurt ran deep. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. The nurse sat down beside him, her eyes kind. "She's been through some kind of trauma, Mr. Whitmore. We don't know the details yet, but her fear, her hesitation, it's not just from being cold or hungry. She's been through something, and she's afraid to speak about it." Caleb nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had seen the way the girl reacted when he tried to talk to her. She had looked at him with wide eyes, a mix of fear and something else, something he couldn't quite place. Trust, maybe, or maybe it was hope, the kind of hope that a child would hold on to when they thought they had nothing left. Caleb didn't know if she would ever open up to him, but he knew that he had to be there for her. He had to help her, in whatever way he could. The nurse stood up, taking the chart with her. "We'll keep her for a little longer, just to be sure. If you'd like, we can arrange a meeting with a counselor, someone she can talk to when she's ready." Caleb stood up as well, his mind made up. "I'll be here," he said, his voice firm. "I'll stay with her." As the nurse left, Caleb sat back down in the chair beside the bed, his thoughts swirling. The little girl was still asleep, but her breathing was steady, calm. He reached out and took her tiny hand in his, holding it gently. It was then that he realized something. He wasn't just here for her. He wasn't just a man with a duty to do the right thing. He was here because he needed her, just as much as she needed him. For years, Caleb had built his life around control, around success, around making sure everything went according to plan. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't have a plan. He didn't know what would happen next. didn't know what the future held. All he knew was that he had a chance to do something good, to make a difference, and he wasn't going to walk away from that. The door opened again, and this time, it was a police officer who stepped in. Caleb looked up, his heart sinking. He had been expecting this. Someone would come looking for the little girl. They would want to know who she was, where she came from, why she was alone. The officer looked at Caleb, and then at the girl in the bed. "We've been alerted about a missing child," the officer said, his voice low and serious. "Do you know who she is?" Caleb stood up slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know where she came from or why she was out there on her own. But he knew one thing for sure. This little girl, she had already changed his life. He wasn't going to let anyone take her away. Not now. Not ever. "She's safe now," Caleb said firmly. The officer looked at him for a moment, as if deciding whether to push further. But then he nodded. "All right," the officer said. "We'll need to ask her some questions when she wakes up." Caleb nodded, his mind made up. "I'll be here when she's ready to talk." As the officer left, Caleb sat back down beside the bed, his hand still holding the little girl's. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this little girl face the world alone. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds, casting a warm glow over the room. Caleb had been sitting in the same chair by the little girl's bed all night, unwilling to leave her side. She had finally fallen into a peaceful sleep, her breathing steady. But Caleb couldn't seem to rest. He kept replaying everything in his mind the moment he had found her, the pain in her eyes, the fear that gripped her so tightly. And now, after all this time, he still didn't know who she was, why she was alone, or what had brought her to him in the first place. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and he looked up to see the nurse entering the room. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. "She's awake. Do you want to talk to her?" Caleb stood up quickly, his heart racing. He had been dreading this moment, unsure of what to say or how to approach her, but he couldn't avoid it anymore. He had to know what had happened to her, and he needed her to trust him. The nurse led him to the bed, and Caleb sat down beside the little girl, who was now awake and staring at the ceiling. Her eyes were wide, still filled with the same fear he had seen the night before. She didn't say anything at first, just kept her gaze fixed ahead. Caleb gently placed a hand on her arm, and she flinched, pulling away slightly. His heart sank at the reaction, but he quickly pulled his hand back, not wanting to make her feel any more uncomfortable. "Hey," he said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm Caleb. You're safe here." She didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. Caleb's mind raced, trying to figure out what to say next. "I know you're scared," he continued, his voice gentle, "but you don't have to be. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." There was a long silence, and Caleb waited patiently, hoping she would say something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the little girl turned her head toward him, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question caught Caleb off guard. He hadn't expected her to speak at all, let alone ask him why he had helped her. He didn't have an easy answer, not one that made sense in a way that she would understand. "Because," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "because you needed help. And when I saw you, I couldn't just walk away. No one should be alone. Not like that." The little girl stared at him for a long time, as if weighing his words. She seemed to be searching for something in his face, something real, something trustworthy. Finally, she spoke again, her voice small but steady. "I don't remember where I came from," she said softly. I don't remember who I am. Caleb's heart broke at her words. She had been through so much, and now she had lost herself in the process. You're not alone anymore, he said, trying to reassure her. We'll figure it out together. We'll find out who you are, and we'll make sure you're safe. The girl looked at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. But there was a glimmer of hope there too, something that hadn't been there before. She slowly nodded, as if she was beginning to believe him. Caleb sat with her for a long time, just talking quietly, trying to comfort her. But he knew the journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As the day wore on, Caleb made arrangements to have a child services officer come by to help identify the girl. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be questions. There would be procedures. But for the first time in a long time, Caleb felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He wasn't just a man who lived in a world of numbers and business deals. He was someone who could make a real difference. The little girl wasn't just a problem to solve. She was a person to protect. Someone who had been lost, but was now starting to find her way. Caleb spent the rest of the afternoon with her, talking more, getting to know her in the little ways that mattered. He learned that her name was Ava, that she had been alone for what felt like forever, and that she missed her mother. The memories were fragmented, but they were starting to come back, little by little. Caleb didn't know how long it would take to get to the bottom of her story, or how long it would take for her to heal, but he was ready to face whatever came next. You're safe here, Ava, he said softly, as he helped her settle back into the bed. And no matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and trust. But for the first time, there was a hint of something else, a small flicker of hope. Caleb smiled gently, knowing that, whatever the future held, they would face it together. The days passed slowly, each one a quiet reminder of the journey ahead. Caleb kept his promise to Ava, staying by her side, offering comfort, and helping her piece together the fragments of her past. It wasn't easy, not by any means. Each day brought new challenges, new struggles, but also moments of breakthrough. Moments where Ava's trust in him grew just a little bit stronger. There were still times when she looked at him with uncertainty, but there were also moments when she smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. It was in those moments that Caleb knew they were making progress. One afternoon, as they sat together in the small waiting area of the clinic, Caleb noticed Ava staring out the window. Her expression was distant, her eyes unfocused. He had learned not to push her too much, but he couldn't help but wonder what was going on in her mind. Ava? He asked softly. She didn't respond at first, but then she slowly turned her head toward him. What's on your mind? She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes shifting to the ground, and then she spoke in a soft, almost reluctant voice. I remember my mom, she said quietly. I remember her singing to me. Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. He could see the pain in her eyes, the longing for something that was lost. What did she sing? He asked, hoping to help her reconnect with those memories. Ava's face softened as she thought for a moment. Then she began to hum a soft melody, the tune gentle and sweet. Caleb listened intently, not interrupting, letting her share this small piece of her past. As she hummed, he realized just how much she had already endured, and how much she still needed to heal. He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure: he would be there for her. He would help her reclaim the pieces of her life that had been taken from her. After a few moments, Ava stopped humming, and she turned to face him. I don't remember much else, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know where she went, or why I'm here. Caleb nodded, his heart heavy with empathy. He didn't have all the answers either, but he knew that Ava was not alone anymore, and that was a start. "We'll figure it out together," he said softly. "We'll find your mom, and we'll make sure you're safe." Ava looked at him, her eyes full of a quiet hope that Caleb hadn't seen before. For the first time since he had met her, she seemed to believe that things might be okay. As the days went by, Caleb continued to help Ava piece together the puzzle of her life. He worked with the authorities, filing reports, asking questions, doing everything he could to find her mother. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he couldn't give up. The bond between them was growing stronger with each passing day. But Caleb also knew that the road ahead was long. Ava was still fragile, still haunted by the fear of what had happened to her, and Caleb knew that it would take time for her to heal. But he was determined. He had promised her that she was safe, and he would keep that promise. One evening, as they sat together in the small apartment Caleb had rented for them, Ava spoke again, her voice small but steady. "Do you think she's out there somewhere?" she asked, looking up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Caleb paused for a moment, considering her question. He didn't have a definitive answer, but he knew that there was always hope. "I believe she's out there," he said quietly, "and we'll keep looking for her. But no matter what happens, you're not alone anymore." Ava nodded, her eyes beginning to water as she looked at him. She didn't speak, but the silent gratitude in her gaze said more than words ever could. Caleb reached out and gently took her hand in his, squeezing it reassuringly. As he looked at Ava, he knew that this was just the beginning of her journey. They would face many more challenges, but together, they would face them. And in that moment, Caleb realized that, in saving Ava, he had found something he had been searching for all along: purpose, connection, and the chance to finally be the person he had always wanted to be. He wasn't just a millionaire CEO anymore. He was someone who could make a difference in someone's life, someone who could give hope when it seemed like there was none left. And as Ava's small hand curled around his, Caleb knew that he had a responsibility now, not just to his company, but to this little girl, to her future, and to the family they were becoming, one small step at a time. Weeks passed, and with each passing day, Caleb and Ava grew closer. The little girl had begun to heal, slowly but surely, though her progress was marked by small steps rather than sudden breakthroughs. Caleb could see the fear still lurking behind her eyes, the anxiety that would creep up on her at unexpected moments. But there was also something new, something bright, something alive that Caleb had never seen in her before. It was hope. Slowly, but unmistakably, Ava was beginning to trust again. Caleb had become her anchor in the storm. She would seek him out when she felt scared, would curl up next to him when the memories overwhelmed her. Caleb wasn't sure what had happened to her mother or why she had ended up alone, but he was determined to find answers. He had done everything he could to help her feel safe, and as time went on, he felt more certain than ever that he wasn't going to leave her side. One evening, as they sat together watching the rain fall outside their apartment window, Caleb noticed a subtle shift in Ava. She was sitting up a little straighter, her hands folded neatly in her lap, looking out the window with a thoughtful expression on her face. For the first time in a while, she wasn't holding her stuffed animal. Caleb watched her quietly, wondering what was going through her mind. "Ava?" he asked gently. She turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think my mom's still alive?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't an easy question, not by any means. He had no idea where Ava's mother was or what had happened to her, but he knew one thing: Ava needed an answer, even if it wasn't the one she wanted to hear. "I don't know," Caleb said softly. his voice steady. But what I do know is that we'll keep looking. We'll never stop trying to find her. Ava nodded slowly, her eyes not leaving his. There was a glimmer of something in her gaze, a spark of hope, but also a trace of fear, as if she was afraid that Caleb's words were just empty promises. Caleb's heart ached at the thought. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay. He wanted to promise her that they would find her mother and that everything would go back to the way it should be. But he couldn't make that promise. Not yet. "You're not alone anymore," Caleb added, his voice firm. "No matter what happens, you'll never be alone again." Ava's eyes softened at his words, and she smiled a little, a smile that was both shy and sincere. Caleb smiled back, feeling a wave of emotion rush over him. He had never been the kind of man to let his guard down, but with Ava, he couldn't help it. She had cracked something open in him, something that had been locked away for years. And now, as he looked at her, this brave, beautiful little girl, he knew he would do anything to protect her. The phone rang, interrupting the quiet moment between them. Caleb stood up quickly and answered it, his pulse quickening as he recognized the number. It was the child services officer. "Mr. Whitmore," the officer's voice came through the phone. "We have some new information about Ava's case." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've traced a possible lead on her mother," the officer said. "There's a woman in a shelter who might be able to help us. We think she might be Ava's mother." Caleb felt his stomach drop. The uncertainty, the not knowing, had been eating at him for so long. But now, finally, there was a chance, a real chance. "I'll be there," Caleb said immediately. "I'll come as soon as I can." He turned to Ava, who had been watching him curiously. "Ava," he said gently, "we might have found your mom." Ava's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. "You mean, really?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope. Caleb nodded, a sense of relief flooding through him. "Yes, we're going to find her." Ava stood up, her face brightening for the first time in days. "Can we go now?" she asked eagerly. Caleb smiled, feeling the same surge of hope. "Let's go," he said, taking her hand. They left the apartment and drove to the shelter, the car moving through the streets as the rain continued to fall. But this time, it felt different. This time, there was hope in the air. And for the first time in a long time, Caleb felt like he wasn't just moving through the motions of life. He was part of something real, something important. They arrived at the shelter, and Caleb walked with Ava inside, his heart pounding in his chest. They met with the shelter coordinator, who led them to a small room where a woman sat waiting. As soon as she saw Ava, her eyes filled with tears. "Ava?" she whispered. And that was all it took. Ava ran to her, and Caleb watched as they embraced, the little girl's face pressed against her mother's chest. For a moment, Caleb stood there, watching them, overwhelmed with emotion. He had promised Ava that he would never let her be alone again, and he had kept that promise. He hadn't just found her mother, he had found a family that had been lost, but was now, finally, whole again. The reunion was everything Caleb had hoped for and more. But as Ava stood in her mother's arms, he couldn't help but feel a rush of emotions. The sight of a little girl finally reunited with the woman she had longed for, and the woman who had longed for her, was powerful beyond words. Ava's mother, whose name was Michelle, held her tightly, rocking her back and forth, as tears streamed down both their faces. Caleb stood off to the side, giving them space to reconnect, but his heart ached with a mix of joy and sadness. He had promised Ava he would find her mother, and now that promise had been fulfilled. But as he watched the two of them together, he realized that his role in Ava's life was far from over. He had become a part of her journey, and that bond was something he couldn't walk away from. Michelle finally pulled away from Ava, looking at her daughter with eyes full of love and regret. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I never wanted to leave you. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong." Ava wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to be brave. "Where did you go, Mommy?" she asked, her voice small, fragile. Caleb could see the pain in Michelle's eyes as she struggled to find the right words. I got lost," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I had to go away for a while, but I never meant to leave you. I've always loved you, Ava. Always." Ava looked at her mother for a long moment, then slowly nodded, as if trying to process the years of pain and confusion. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you love me." Caleb watched as Michelle knelt down to Ava's level, wrapping her arms around her again. There was so much healing to do, so much that needed to be said. But for now, in that moment, they just held each other, and it felt like the world had stopped. Caleb stepped back, his heart full of quiet gratitude. He had been part of something incredible, something that would change Ava's life forever. And yet, as he stood there, he realized he didn't want to leave them. They had been through so much together. And though Michelle and Ava had their own journey to walk, Caleb had become a part of that journey too. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew one thing. Ava and Michelle were his family now. "You did it," a voice behind him said. Caleb turned to see the child services officer standing in the doorway, smiling warmly. "You brought them back together." Caleb smiled back, though it was a bittersweet smile. "I just helped," he said softly. "They did all the hard work." The officer nodded. "Still, it's not every day we see something like this. You gave her the greatest gift, a chance to heal." Caleb nodded, his mind still processing the depth of everything that had happened. "It was my privilege," he said quietly. As the day went on, Caleb watched as Michelle and Ava began to talk. Michelle shared the story of where she had been, why she had left, and how she had never stopped thinking about her daughter. Ava listened, her eyes filled with understanding and a newfound strength. They were starting over, but it wouldn't be easy. There would be more tears, more struggles, but for the first time, it felt like they had a real chance at happiness. Caleb stepped outside for a moment, needing a breath of fresh air. He walked around the side of the shelter, his thoughts heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. He had come into this with the intention of doing the right thing, but he hadn't expected to find something so much bigger. He hadn't expected to find family. As the wind rustled through the trees, Caleb realized how much his own life had changed. He had spent so many years focused on his career, on building his empire. But now, it felt like none of that mattered. What mattered was the bond he had with Ava, the connection they had formed. And what mattered was the chance to give her a better life, to give her a future full of love and hope. Caleb took a deep breath and smiled to himself. This wasn't the end of his journey, not by a long shot. There was still so much work to do, so many challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Caleb felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. He walked back into the shelter, where Ava and Michelle were waiting for him. Ava looked up at him as he entered, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb smiled and knelt down beside her. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "I'll always be here for you." And in that moment, Caleb knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Ava, Michelle, and him. A family, reunited, ready to begin a new chapter. Weeks passed, and with each new day, the bond between Caleb, Ava, and Michelle only grew stronger. Caleb's life had changed in ways he never could have predicted. His world, once focused solely on business and ambition, had expanded into something far richer, more meaningful. He had learned the value of family, of connection, and of the power of love to heal the deepest wounds. Ava had been through so much in her young life, and the path to healing was not easy, but with each small victory, Caleb could see her strength. She had started smiling again, her laughter becoming more frequent, though it was still fragile at times. There were moments when the pain would come rushing back, memories she wasn't ready to face. But Caleb was there, patient, offering her a safe place to express herself. Michelle, too, was on her own journey of healing. She had made mistakes that had cost her precious years with her daughter, but she was determined to make it right. The time she had lost could never be regained. But Caleb could see that she was trying with everything she had to rebuild the relationship with Ava. Michelle wasn't perfect, but she was sincere, and that was enough for Ava. Caleb often found himself amazed at the resilience of both of these women. Despite all they had been through, they were finding their way back to each other, piece by piece. Caleb had always been someone who saw problems as things to solve, logistics to manage, but now, with Ava and Michelle, he understood something deeper. Healing wasn't about fixing something broken. It was about supporting each other through the pain, being there when it was most needed. One evening, as Caleb and Michelle were sitting together after dinner, Michelle turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I can never thank you enough," she said quietly. "You've given me back my daughter." Caleb shook his head, a humble smile on his face. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "Ava's strength is what brought her back." Michelle nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know how I would have made it through this without you," she said. "You didn't just help me find Ava. You've shown me what it means to truly be a father again. I've seen how much you care for her, and I don't know how I'll ever be able to repay you." Caleb's heart tightened at her words. He wasn't used to being thanked, especially not for something that had come so naturally to him. But he understood now. What he had done wasn't just about helping someone in need. It was about being there for them in ways they had never experienced before. It was about showing Ava and Michelle that they were not alone in this world, that they could trust again. "You don't need to repay me," Caleb said, his voice steady. "The only thing I want is for you and Ava to be happy. That's all that matters." Michelle smiled, her eyes softening with emotion. "I know we have a long road ahead of us," she said, "but I believe we'll make it. Together." Caleb smiled back. "Together," he echoed. As time went on, Ava continued to flourish. She was becoming more confident, more comfortable with her new life. Caleb watched with pride as she started school again, making friends, and learning to trust people again. It wasn't easy, there were still difficult days, but with each challenge she faced, Caleb saw how much she had grown. He was amazed at the young woman she was becoming. One afternoon, as he picked Ava up from school, she got into the car with a big grin on her face. "Guess what, Caleb?" she asked excitedly. "I made a new friend. Her name's Lily, and she's in my class." Caleb felt a surge of pride. "That's great," he said, smiling at her. "I'm really happy for you, Ava." Ava beamed, her smile lighting up the car. "I'm happy too," she said. "I think I'm finally starting to feel like I belong again." Caleb's heart swelled with happiness. This was the moment he had been waiting for, when Ava truly began to heal. As they drove home, Caleb couldn't help but feel that everything had come full circle. He had promised Ava that he would always be there for her, and he had kept that promise. But it wasn't just about being there in the hard moments, it was about being there in the joyful moments too. He was a part of her life, and she was a part of his. No matter what came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, Caleb truly felt like his life had meaning. It wasn't about his success, his wealth, or his accomplishments. It was about this being part of something real, something that mattered, being part of a family, the family that had been rebuilt, piece by piece, and the family that would always have each other's backs. Together, they could face whatever challenges the world had in store for them, because they weren't just surviving anymore, they were living. And that was enough. The weeks after Ava's reunion with her mother were a whirlwind of emotions. Caleb found himself reflecting on everything that had transpired. He had always considered himself a man of logic, someone who relied on facts and numbers to guide his decisions. But with Ava and Michelle, he had learned that life wasn't always about control and certainty. Sometimes, it was about embracing the unknown, letting go of the need to have all the answers, and simply being present for the people who mattered most. Ava and Michelle were still working through their past, and there were days when the weight of those years felt unbearable. But Caleb knew that they were healing, that every day they spent together was another step forward. Ava had begun to open up more, slowly sharing memories from her past, each one a piece of the puzzle that had been missing for so long. Michelle, too, was slowly rebuilding her life. She had made mistakes, but she was trying, and that was all anyone could ask for. Caleb didn't know where the road would take them, but he was no longer afraid. He had found something more important than success. He had found a purpose. One afternoon, Caleb decided to take Ava and Michelle on a small trip, just to spend some time together outside of the usual routine. They drove to a nearby park, a place where they could relax and enjoy the simplicity of nature. As they walked along the trail, Caleb felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. The sun was shining, the air was fresh, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like everything was as it should be. Ava and Michelle were laughing as they walked ahead, enjoying the day, and Caleb couldn't help but smile. It was moments like these that reminded him of the importance of family. He had spent so much of his life chasing after things that, in the end, didn't matter as much as the people who cared about him. As they reached a clearing in the park, Ava turned to him with a smile. "Thank you for everything, Caleb," she said, her voice full of sincerity. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Caleb smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. "You don't need to thank me, Ava. I'm just happy that I could be here for you." They spent the rest of the afternoon enjoying the park, walking, talking, and just being together. It was a simple day, but it was everything. By the time they returned home, Caleb felt a sense of contentment that had eluded him for so long. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There were still challenges to face, and the scars of the past would always be there. But Caleb knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking that road alone anymore. He had found his family, and he would do whatever it took to make sure they were safe and happy. The following weeks were a time of adjustment, as Michelle and Ava settled into their new life. Caleb continued to support them in every way he could, but he also knew that they needed time to heal. Ava was starting school again, and while it was a challenge for her, she was beginning to flourish. Michelle was working on rebuilding her career, taking the steps she needed to make a fresh start. For Caleb, it was a time of reflection. He had always been focused on his career, but now he found himself thinking more about the future, not just for himself, but for the family he had gained. He wanted to ensure that Ava and Michelle had everything they needed to build a life full of love, security, and happiness. One evening, after dinner, Caleb sat with Ava and Michelle in the living room. He watched as they talked about their day, laughing and joking with each other. It was a simple moment, but it was one that meant everything to Caleb. He had always thought that success was about reaching the top, about accumulating wealth and status. But now he realized that true success wasn't about what you had, it was about who you shared your life with, and the love and support you gave one another. He looked at Ava, her face glowing with happiness, and at Michelle, her eyes filled with gratitude, and he knew that everything he had been through had led him to this moment. He had found something more meaningful than any business deal or achievement. He had found family. And it was everything. As he sat there, content in the warmth of the moment, he made a promise to himself. No matter what the future held, he would be there for them. He would protect them, support them, and love them. Always. Ava had found her way back to her mother, and Michelle had found her way back to her daughter, and together, they had found their way to him. The road they had traveled had been long and difficult, but it had led them to a place of healing, of hope, and of love. And for Caleb, that was all that mattered. The days continued to pass, and life began to take on a new rhythm for Caleb, Ava, and Michelle. The challenges they had faced were far from over, but the wounds of the past seemed less raw, less painful with each passing day. Ava had found a new confidence in herself, a spark of joy that had been missing for so long. It wasn't an easy road, and there were still moments when fear would creep into her eyes, but with Caleb and Michelle by her side, she was learning to trust again. School was becoming more manageable for her. She had made a few friends, and every day she seemed to grow a little stronger, a little more comfortable in her new life. The memories of the past still lingered, but they didn't define her anymore. Michelle, too, was learning to navigate this new chapter of her life. She had taken a few small steps toward rebuilding her career, and though it was a slow process, she was determined to provide for her daughter and build a future they could be proud of. Caleb had watched her struggle with guilt over the years she had lost, but he could see that she was trying, and that was what mattered. He knew that Michelle wasn't perfect, but her love for Ava was unwavering. Together, they were learning to heal, to rebuild what had been broken, and to make up for the time they had lost. One evening, after dinner, as the three of them sat on the couch in the living room, Ava turned to Caleb with a thoughtful expression on her face. "Caleb," she said hesitantly, "do you ever think about the past? Like, the things that happened before we found each other?" Caleb looked at her, surprised by the question. He had never really thought about the past in the way she meant, not in the context of everything that had happened before Ava came into his life. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "but I don't let it control me. The past is behind us now, Ava. What matters is today, and what we choose to do with the future." Ava nodded slowly, as if she were processing his words. Then she smiled, a soft, almost wistful smile. "I guess that makes sense," she said. Caleb smiled back, proud of how far she had come. "You've come a long way, Ava," he said gently. "You've learned to face the past and still move forward. That's something a lot of people never learn to do." Ava's smile widened, and for a moment, she looked every bit the child she was meant to be, full of promise and potential. It wasn't always easy, but she had made peace with what had happened, and that was the first step toward healing. As time went on, Caleb's role in Ava's life became more defined. He wasn't just her protector or her support system anymore. He had become someone who helped her grow, someone who challenged her to reach for things she had once believed were out of her reach. One afternoon, as they sat in the park, Caleb watched Ava playing with her new friends. She was laughing, carefree, and for the first time in a long time, Caleb saw the light in her eyes that had been absent for so long. It was a reminder of how much they had all been through, but also of how far they had come. Michelle was sitting beside him, a quiet smile on her face as she watched her daughter. "She's really come a long way, hasn't she?" she said softly. Caleb nodded, his heart full of pride. She has. And so have you. Michelle glanced at him, her eyes soft with emotion. I never thought this day would come, she said quietly. I never thought I would get the chance to be her mom again, to be the kind of mother she deserves. Caleb reached over and took her hand. You're doing great, he said gently. It's not about being perfect. It's about being there for her, every step of the way. And you're doing that. Michelle smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. Thank you, Caleb. I don't know how to thank you enough for everything you've done for us. Caleb squeezed her hand. You don't have to thank me, he said softly. I'm just happy that you and Ava have found each other again, that's all that matters. As they watched Ava, Caleb knew that their journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But they would face them together, as a family. For the first time in a long time, Caleb felt a sense of peace, a sense of purpose. The past had been painful, but the future was full of hope. And that was something worth fighting for. Months passed, and the healing journey that Caleb, Ava, and Michelle had embarked on was taking root in ways that none of them had imagined. Life was no longer defined by the chaos of the past, but by the promise of the future. The scars were still there, but they were fading slowly as the wounds of their shared history began to close. Ava had started to thrive in school. Her teachers noticed the change in her. A quiet confidence had taken root, and she no longer shied away from socializing or participating in class. She had a group of friends now, and though she still had moments of doubt, she was becoming more and more like the child Caleb had hoped she would be. Michelle, too, was making strides. She had found a part-time job working at a local community center, helping children who were going through similar struggles. It wasn't much, but it gave her a sense of purpose. And, more importantly, it gave her a chance to give back. It wasn't easy to balance everything, but she was doing it, and Caleb couldn't help but admire her strength. One evening, after dinner, they were sitting together in the living room. Ava was working on a school project, and Michelle was flipping through a book, looking for inspiration for a new craft project for the children at the center. Caleb was reading through some work emails, but his thoughts were far from his business. His mind kept drifting to the two women in the room with him, the two people who had completely changed his life in ways he couldn't quite explain. He had always been a man driven by ambition and success, but now he found that the things he once thought were most important seemed insignificant in comparison to what he had gained. It wasn't about the companies he had built or the wealth he had amassed. It was about the family he had found. About Ava, who had come into his life so unexpectedly and had shown him the power of love and resilience. About Michelle, whose past mistakes were part of the story of who she was, but who was now creating a new future, not just for herself, but for her daughter. He put his phone down and looked at them both. Ava glanced up at him and smiled, her eyes bright with the happiness of a child who had finally found peace. Michelle caught his gaze and offered a soft smile in return. It was the kind of smile that spoke of gratitude, of acknowledgement, and of the bond they shared. It was a quiet moment, but one that spoke volumes. Caleb cleared his throat and stood up, walking over to where Ava and Michelle were sitting. I just wanted to say, he started, his voice a little rougher than he intended, how much I appreciate you both. You've changed my life in ways I can't even explain. Michelle looked up at him, her eyes soft. We've all changed each other, she said gently. Caleb nodded. True, he said, but I don't think I could have imagined a better life for myself than the one I have now. He turned to Ava, who was looking up at him, her smile wide. You've taught me more than you know, Ava. You've shown me what really matters in life. Ava's eyes shone with emotion. You've always been there for me, she said softly. I don't know what I would have done without you. Caleb smiled at her, his heart full. And I'll always be here for you, Ava. That's a promise. Michelle reached out and touched Caleb's hand. You're a part of our family now, she said quietly, and we're so grateful for that. Caleb felt the weight of her words settle into his heart. It wasn't just about what he had done for them. It was about the way they had all come together, the way they had supported each other, and the way they had found healing. They were no longer a family defined by their pasts. They were a family built on love, trust, and a commitment to one another. As the evening continued, they shared stories, laughed together, and made plans for the future. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. It was a family. And for Caleb, that was everything. Life was unpredictable, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time, he felt like he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that, no matter what, they would face it together. Ava had found her way back to Michelle, and Michelle had found her way back to Ava. And through it all, Caleb had found something he had been missing for far too long. A purpose, a family, and the knowledge that love could heal even the deepest wounds. No, the days stretched into months, and the once uncertain future that Caleb, Ava, and Michelle faced began to feel more like a path they were walking together, hand in hand. Though the journey was far from over, the pain and fear that had once seemed overwhelming were now just memories. The scars, both visible and invisible, had faded, but had not disappeared completely. They had become a part of their story, a story of survival, of redemption, and of love. Ava, once a scared, quiet girl lost in the shadows of her past, was now blossoming. She had started to dream again. Caleb watched her, amazed by the way she approached the world with a newfound confidence. She was no longer the fragile child who shied away from connection. She was making friends, excelling in school, and for the first time in a long time, her laughter filled the house, bright and free. Michelle, too, had grown in ways that Caleb had not expected. Her past had been marked by mistakes, but she was no longer defined by them. She was building a life not just for herself, but for Ava. She was present in a way that Caleb had never seen before, fully committed to the life they were now creating together. One day, Caleb came home from a meeting to find Michelle sitting at the kitchen table, deep in thought. She looked up as he entered, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Hey," she said softly. "I was thinking about something." Caleb raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" he asked, setting down his briefcase and taking a seat across from her. "I've been thinking about going back to school," she said, her voice steady but filled with determination. Caleb was surprised. He had never known Michelle to mention anything like that before. "Really?" he asked, genuinely impressed. "Yeah," she nodded. "I want to finish what I started. I want to show Ava that anything is possible if you're willing to work for it." Caleb smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He had seen Michelle face so much hardship, and now, here she was, ready to fight for her future and her daughter's future. "I think that's amazing," he said, his voice full of support. "Whatever you need, I'm here. We're here." Michelle's eyes softened, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. She wasn't just trying to rebuild her life. She was showing Ava that growth, change, and second chances were possible, no matter the circumstances. As the months went by, Caleb watched as Michelle took steps toward her goal. She enrolled in online classes, balancing her job, her responsibilities as a mother, and her studies. It wasn't easy, but Michelle had always been a fighter. She pushed through the tough days, knowing that the end result would be worth it. Ava was also thriving in ways Caleb had never imagined. She had taken a strong interest in art, spending hours drawing, painting, and experimenting with different materials. Caleb had never seen her so focused, so passionate about something. One evening, as Caleb sat in the living room, he watched Ava carefully sketching on a piece of paper. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she added shading to her drawing. "Hey, Ava," Caleb called softly. She looked up, smiling. "Hi, Caleb," she said, her voice full of warmth. "What are you working on?" he asked, leaning forward. Ava held up the paper to show him. It was a drawing of a tree, its branches stretching out in all directions, its roots deep in the ground. It was simple but beautiful, and Caleb could see the care she had put into it. "It's a tree," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "It's like the tree I drew when I first came here, the one I painted with Mom." Caleb smiled. "It's amazing, Ava. You've really found something you're passionate about." Ava's smile widened. "I think I want to be an artist when I grow up," she said, her voice filled with determination. Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. This little girl, who had once been so lost, had found a piece of herself. And that was all he had ever wanted for her. He reached over and ruffled her hair. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said, his voice full of pride. "You can be anything you want, Ava. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." As Ava beamed, Caleb's mind wandered back to the days when he had first met her, when she was nothing more than a scared little girl, lost in the cold. He had promised her that he would always be there for her, and as he watched her now, growing into a young woman full of hope and possibility, he knew he had kept that promise. The next morning, Caleb woke up to the sound of laughter. He walked into the kitchen to find Michelle making breakfast, while Ava sat at the table, excitedly showing her mom a new drawing she had started. For the first time in a long time, Caleb realized that they were no longer a family, pieced together by circumstances. They were a real family, built on love, trust, and the shared experiences that bound them together. Life was no longer defined by what had been lost, but by what they had gained. They had come through the darkness and emerged into the light, together, stronger than before. And as Caleb watched Ava and Michelle, he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The future was theirs to shape, and he would walk with them every step of the way. The sun was setting on a quiet Sunday evening, casting a warm, golden glow over the small house that had once felt so empty. Caleb sat on the porch, his feet propped up on the railing, watching as Ava and Michelle played in the yard. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer had the same hold over them. Now, they had something better: hope. As he watched them, Caleb couldn't help but smile. He had come a long way from the lonely CEO who once measured success in dollars and business deals. Now, his measure of success was different. It was the laughter of a child, the warmth of a family that had found its way back to each other, and the quiet, everyday moments that made life worth living. Ava had grown into a confident, strong young girl who had learned to face the world with courage, not fear. Michelle, too, had blossomed into a woman who had found her place not just as a mother, but as a person in her own right. She had rebuilt her life, piece by piece, and in doing so, had shown Ava the true meaning of resilience. Caleb's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Michelle approaching, holding a cup of coffee in her hands. "You know," she said with a smile, sitting down beside him, "I never imagined this would be our life." Caleb chuckled softly. "Me neither," he said, taking the cup from her and sipping it. "But I wouldn't change a thing." Michelle leaned back in her chair, gazing out at the yard. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she asked, her voice soft. "We have," Caleb replied, "but we're just getting started." There was a long silence between them, comfortable and peaceful. For the first time, Caleb realized how much he had needed this moment. The peace, the stillness, the simple joy of just being together. He had spent so much of his life focused on things that didn't truly matter, but now he understood that the things that mattered most were right in front of him. Michelle turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Caleb smiled at her, his heart full. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I'm just glad I could be a part of this." Michelle reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're not just a part of this, Caleb. You're a part of our family." The words hung in the air between them, and Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. It was a simple statement, but it was one that carried so much weight. He had become a part of their lives in a way he never expected. And now, there was no going back. He was home. Ava ran up to the porch, her face lit up with excitement. "Caleb! Mom! Look at what I made." She held out a drawing, a picture of the three of them together, surrounded by a large tree with roots that seemed to stretch deep into the earth. "It's us," Ava said, her voice full of pride. Caleb's heart swelled with emotion as he took the drawing from her. It was simple, yet beautiful, just like the family they had become. "It's perfect, Ava," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I love it." Michelle smiled as she looked at the drawing. "You're really something special, Ava," she said, her voice full of love. Ava beamed. "I'm glad you think so, Mom." Caleb looked at them both, his heart full. This was his family now. The road had been long, and the past had been painful, but they had made it through. Together, they had built something stronger than anything Caleb had ever imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Caleb realized that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, but they would face them together. The pain of the past was no longer a shadow hanging over them. It was something they had learned from, something that had shaped who they were, but it no longer defined them. They had a future now, a future full of possibilities. And Caleb knew, as he watched Ava run around the yard with Michelle, that this was everything he had ever wanted. He didn't need anything more. He had found what mattered most: a family to love, a family to cherish, and a future that was full of hope.